All right. Well, I'm here with Michael Jones from Inspiring Philosophy. Um, so, Mike, if you just want to quickly introduce yourself, talk about what you do on your channel, if you've always been a theist and, maybe your educational background.
Yeah, so currently I'm in school to get a graduate degree in philosophy at the University of Arizona. So that's what I'm currently doing right now. I got 1 year down, one more to go. So basically, that's my educational background as for now.
Right.
I've been doing the YouTube channel for about 10 years now, though. I would say I've probably always been a theist, but I've not always been a Christian. Atheism never made logical sense to me, I guess.
Right.
I always thought there might just be some power or force behind the universe, but I became a Christian, I don't know, sometime in the 2000s or first decade. So a while ago.
Yeah. I think that's kind of for me too. Atheism just really never made sense to me either. I mean, if you look at it on the face, if you're listening to people like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris, the new atheists, then maybe it makes sense. But when you really start exploring these deeper arguments, it kind of falls apart. That's at least what happened for me.
Yeah, it just seems like there's too much evidence from all these different angles. There's got to be some sort of personal force, something behind the universe.
Not
yeah,
nothing
something.
or no explanation.
Correct. Yeah.
Right. Okay, so from here we're just going to go into just some questions. Basically, just going to ask you questions.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so the first question I have for you, Mike, is: can we know God exists? For instance, I suppose we can't know God in and of himself, but we can understand some things about God. So, what would you say those things are? In other words, what is our epistemic access to God? Is there a limitation here, or how much can we know?
Yeah, I wouldn't say we can know for sure that God exists currently in our state. Uh, there's always going to be that epistemic gap. Like I can't really know if I'm dreaming right now. I can't really know all sorts of things. And I think God is, of course, a step sort of beyond that in some sense. Like,
Right.
it's, but I could say we can know with a reasonable degree of certainty that God probably does exist given the data that we can see around us or not.
Yeah.
So, I wouldn't say like we can never know, but I think the data is enough to suggest that at least there is some God behind the universe.
Yeah. No, I think that's a cogent explanation. It just seems so
Mm-hmm.
much inductively stronger for me as well.
Yeah.
Than
And
there
I
being
think we can
nothing.
know some things about him, not even from science, but from philosophy, just sort of reasoning about what a first cause would be or what the fundamental substance of the universe would be. So I think we can know some things from just basic philosophy.
Right. Right. That makes sense. Um, So, what do you say to the skeptic who incessantly asserts that you just don't know, right? So, no matter how many arguments you give, the evidence you provide, they just say, "Well, you don't know. You just don't know." How would you
Um,
respond to that?
I mean, you can do that with anything. I mean,
Right.
there were take the ancient skeptics of Greece. They were kind of like that in a lot of ways. They were just, oh, how do you know? How do you know? How do you know? Kind of attitude.
Right.
Even Socrates did a little bit of that, just constantly questioning. And if you take that to a logical extreme, you can literally question everything. So
Yeah.
my view is I take the position called an epistemic particularist. And what the particularist says is that it's on the burden is on the skeptic to actually give me reason to doubt my intuitions or basic facts, you name it, anything around that kind of idea. They got to give me a reason beyond the mere possibility that something could be wrong.
Right.
So if, like, for example, you want to argue, well, our sense of time is not the way it is in reality. B theory of time is more likely. All right, what's your evidence? Well, here's the science.
Right.
Okay, that's good evidence. Now I have reason to doubt this intuition. But if all you're doing is, well, how do you know? How do you know? Can you give me a reason to doubt? No, just the mere possibility. Well, that's not going to be good enough. So the particularist puts the burden on the skeptic to actually give reasons just beyond the mere possibility to doubt. And as far as I see, in a lot of ways, they don't really do that. A lot of these very extreme skeptics don't really present that kind of thing.
Yeah, and it gets really circular. I mean, like you said, that's a good point. You could just say that about anything. I mean, there are people that believe that they are not conscious right now, or that maybe you just don't know if you're conscious. I mean, there comes a point where you have to follow the data and make some kind of inference off of that, right? I mean, that seems like the most reasonable thing to do here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and
Yeah.
I would
So
agree with that.
right, right. So the next question is, if science cannot demonstrate empirically that God exists, then why believe at all? So, many think that science is it's it. There's almost kind of like a dogmatism about science, that there's just that's it. Science, or there's no other way. So what would you say to that?
Well, I would refer to the atheist Thomas Nagel in his book Mining Cosmos, who notes, and very early on, science cannot establish a foundation for science. Before we even do science, we assume a lot of philosophical principles like the scientific method. We assume our cognitive faculties are accurate. We assume scientific realism, that if we study science, we're going to get actual knowledge and information about the external world. Now, I agree science should influence our metaphysics. It should influence our philosophical worldview. There's got to be some sort of shared refining going on there between philosophy and science. But the idea that we just need to use everything for science, and if science doesn't demonstrate something, it just shows you're very ignorant when it comes to philosophy or philosophy of science. Even you need to understand that science comes with a lot of assumptions, and you presuppose those assumptions.
Right.
You just can't use science to establish those assumptions. So the entire argument is self-defeating.
Exactly. And yeah, you make a good point too. I mean, all scientists are doing is assuming that their cognitive faculties are functioning just fine, right? So they're already taking that into account. Also, I would note too that there's this notion that there has always been a war between science and religion, right? But it really seems to be that it's just between the teleological view of, say, Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, and the mechanical view with Hobbes, Locke, Descartes, and Hume, right? So it seems like it's just a worldview here, a conflicting worldview. There's not really a war between science and religion.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a silly argument. I'll be doing a video probably in
Yeah.
August on that kind of idea and go into some interesting studies with regards to people's mentalities about this all. So there's some interesting data on that I want to cover. But yeah, the idea of science and religion are in conflict. It's not only just inaccurate in terms of our modern understanding of religion and science, it's historically inaccurate, because the war between science and religion is an historical myth that was made up in the 1800s. There's no evidence that it actually has been there.
Yeah, and when you tell these people about this, they're kind of surprised, that there are physicists and plenty of scientists that believe in God, right? It's perfectly consistent. Yeah. So.
Oh yeah, I'll be going over some studies on that. Actually, there's some interesting data.
Cool. Looking forward to it, man. So question 4, prove God exists. There is no evidence. Arguments are not evidence. And you also talked about, I saw another video, you talked about Karl Popper and falsification. So if you could maybe just touch upon that, because I think a lot of people, again, going back to science just being dogmatic, and science proves things, right? And philosophy can't do that. So what would you say about that?
Yeah, science doesn't prove things either. There are different theories about how science works. I mean, Karl Popper, for example, thought it was about falsification. Science can only falsify certain things. It can never prove anything. So really, science is sort of just ruling things out, and whatever is left is likely. That was his kind of methodology. I think that's a little inaccurate. I tend to hold to the philosopher of scientists, Emery Lakatos's view. And his idea was that science creates different research programs, and scientists will pursue these research programs. And over time, different research programs will become degenerate, or they'll become progressive research programs. In that they're progressive, they're able to explain more data, their predictions are becoming more successful. If it's a degenerate research program, they have to start making sort of like ad hoc explanations to explain away data. Perhaps you could say that for the electric universe, for example, is a degenerate research program. It's this idea that maybe electricity is I don't know, I may not be phrasing this right, but it's a general idea that electricity is more central to the universe than it is in the standard understanding. I'm pretty sure on this theory, I'd have to check again, but I think they say black holes are not supposed to exist.
Right.
And I think with a lot of the recent,
that's
a lot of the recent data, it would become more degenerate. But go ahead.
Right. And that's what I was going to ask you too, because maybe someone will, object to that and say, well, there's pictures of black holes. I could just show you a black hole on my phone. So
yeah, and they probably have a good explanation to get around it. But I mean, over time, you're just explaining away data. You're not making any predictions, or you're not making a parsimonious account of the way things are.
And science is tentative as well, so. Okay. So question number 5, there are around 70% of philosophers who do not believe in God. Why is this? Is it due to the fact that they do not specialize in philosophy of religion? Because you and I have talked about this before, and you said that around 80% of philosophers who do specialize in philosophy of religion are believers. So why do you think that 70% of philosophers do not believe in God that are outside of philosophy of religion?
I don't think there's a simple answer to that. People really just want a simple answer to a lot of these issues. Like, why is America so religious? Well, because they're dumb. That's you'll see that sometimes. People just want simple answers. There's probably it's probably a multifaceted answer to that kind of thing.
Right.
One of the things I think it is, I will be covering this in my video when I do science and religion, is I'll be looking at surveys that show that a lot of people in academia have biases against religion. Like, people get into academia and there's almost like a bandwagon mentality to be against religion. And there's been some interesting studies that have sort of shown these biases showing up among scientists. A lot of religious scientists feel discriminated against on large percentages, and it's coming from multiple areas too. There's one researcher who's done a lot on it, but others have also contributed to the overall research program. So I think there might actually be some sort of anti-religious bias contributing to the overall reason. And so that is going to be a factor. A lot of people sort of enter academia, they sort of get accepted into this new group, this new tribe. Well, a lot of bias against religion in that tribe. So it's going to dwindle. It's going to create a group mentality. It's going to push religious people away or into other careers, not really be welcoming as much. Now, there's probably all sorts of other reasons, but that could be one of the reasons.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense too. And, another reason too, a lot of mainstream philosophers have never even looked into the arguments for God's existence at all. They kind of just assume that God doesn't exist, right?
Yeah, I won't say this was, but I was talking to one of my professors this year, and it just was very clear he is not up to date on natural theology. It was, he wasn't even aware of one of the modern versions of the ontological argument. He thought things like B theory of time had debunked the cosmological argument, and it was this is just wow. This is I think he's very intelligent on the class he took and everything we covered. But he just, when it came to philosophy of religion, he just was not up to date on that.
Right. So I went to Rutgers University. I got my undergrad in philosophy and psychology, and I would talk to my philosophy professors about God's existence, and a lot of them were just inept about it. They really had no idea. They didn't even know about, say, the Aristotelian proof, from change and whatnot. They didn't really have any comment on it at all. And it's surprising because these are really smart people, but if they're not specializing in this, and you talked about the bias and whatnot, that makes a lot of sense. I saw your video too on atheist bias, I believe. And that was good. Yeah. I think that.
Yeah. Right. Leonard Susskind, one of the most brilliant physicists in the world, I would say, was in an interview and was just talking about the holographic principle. And then someone brought up the idea that maybe this could point to God or something. I forget how it was phrased, but his idea was well, if there's a programmer, who programmed the programmer? And I was like, no, that's a bad argument. Ooh,
I have a question that will pertain to that. Okay, so question 6, why can't there be an infinite regress? And if you could kind of just touch upon what an infinite regress even is, right?
So an infinite regress is not this idea that time is infinitely old. An infinite regress would be an infinite explanations. So what explains the universe? Well, a multiverse. What explains the multiverse? Well, maybe there's brain cosmology. Well, what explains brain cosmology? Quantum fluctuation. You keep going, and that goes on infinitely. You can't have that because there's no explanation in that. You're always appealing to something else to get to explain the thing before. So I think I got this from John Lennox, but it's an analogy. It's like if you asked to borrow a book and I said, well, I don't have it. I got to get it from my friend. And so I went to him and he's like, well, I don't have it. I got to get it from my friend. And that went on infinitely. We would need to ask, does the book exist? And the answer is no, because you just have an infinite chain of people asking for a book without
Right.
ever actually getting to the book. So likewise, if you have an infinite regress, you don't ever explain anything. You just have an infinite chain of things there without an explanation.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, that kind of reminds me of Leibniz. He talks about, imagine if there's like eternal copies of geometry books, and it just goes on forever. Vicious infinite regress. Well, that itself is not an explanation. It's just constantly deferring. There's no explanation in that, and it seems to me that there must be something that evades this dynamic of contingency, right? This necessary being that even gives rise for the possibility of any contingency at all. You know what I mean? Because a contingent phenomena is a contingent phenomena, right? So it seems like there must be something which falls outside of that to even give rise
Correct.
for that contingency. Um, okay, so here's the big question of the hour here. What caused God? Right.
Nothing.
Right. So, people, and I can understand, without looking into the arguments, God has just always existed. People are going to say, well, how? I mean, that's just incredible. How is that the case? What would you, what would you say to that?
I would point out a lot of the same reasoning behind the infinite regress we talked about, and just get them to agree, even as someone like Graham Oppie, who's an atheist, agrees, there's got to be some foundational base of reality, something that somewhere the buck stops. And whatever that thing was, whatever that being or entity was, it could not have been caused. It just simply is. It doesn't need an explanation beyond itself. So everything has an explanation, either in an external cause or in something or within itself. And whatever the first cause was, whatever the fundamental substance of reality, fundamental being, entity, whatever you want to call it, that would be explained by itself.
Yeah.
It would not need to be explained by something else. It just simply would be.
Right. And can you think of any other necessary, maybe truths? I could think of maybe propositions, mathematics. What do you,
Sure. I
just
mean,
to
there
kind of
there
give an
could be. You mean you could think of logical truths. You could think of those kind of things, mathematical propositions. The reason people always try to argue, well, if the fundamental thing is necessary, why is nothing else? And it's
Right.
simple. We don't multiply entities beyond necessity.
Mhm.
We only need to deposit one fundamental substance to explain all of contingency. Sure, for all we know, there could be multiple fundamental substances out there that are uncaused and just sort of exist together. But we don't need to posit that. If there was enough evidence to suggest they were there, then we would. We don't multiply entities beyond necessity. So to explain all of the contingent reality we exist in, we only need to posit one fundamental substance.
Yeah. Right. And, I think that, wait, let me see here. We could always, wonder what caused God in a sense of awe and wonder, right? But the logic, um, that's not a logical thing to come to. Like, the logic is, to me, pretty airtight, that there has to be this necessary being at the bottom of all reality. It
Mhm.
doesn't seem like that can be refuted. So, question number 8: if God has always existed, what was he doing for all of this time before creation? Now, I know we can't really know this. I'm just curious of what you think. It's interesting, nevertheless, to talk about.
Well, my view is that space time is emergent. Our current space time, the universe we live in, I equate that with space time. This
Mhm.
space time is emergent from the underlying fundamental substance. And so time would not be a fundamental aspect to this fundamental substance. It would be something emergent from. So to ask what God was doing, well, technically nothing, because there was no time before
Right.
him or time after. God would actualize all experiences in a single instance. Now, that's extremely hard to intuitively fathom, but that would flow from the logic. If time is emergent, whatever the fundamental substance was would just be timeless. It would be without time, not dwelling in time for an eternity past and then just one moment deciding, okay, now I'm going to create.
Right. Okay. Okay, so question number 9: does God experience pain? If so, why has he not brought an end to the world? All the monstrous suffering that we experience, and a lot of it, I would say, is gratuitous in its nature.
Mhm.
Now, I know you talked about how you're a post-millennialist, so I imagine maybe your response will tie into that a bit.
Yeah, when I tell people that, they think I'm some sort of like anti-millennial of my generation. I'm a post-millennial.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. So post-millennialism, first of all, let me just define that. It's the idea that we're not waiting for a rapture, we're not waiting for a tribulation, we're not waiting for an antichrist. It's that the Great Commission given by Christ is going to eventually turn the whole earth into Eden, into the millennial kingdom, and then Christ will return after that. The reason why he hasn't returned yet is because we'd probably kill him again, because we're still in that fallen type state. So he's using the Great Commission to turn the earth into a paradise. Then he will return when we accept him as king. That's post-millennialism. So the question is, does God experience pain? I would say yes. I think that's clear in scripture. So if you're a Christian, I think that does follow. It doesn't mean God is experiencing, like, is evil in some sense, because pain is not necessarily evil. Pain is not necessarily bad. It can be used for instrumental goodness. And God willingly accepts and shares in the pain of our reality to relate to us, to grow relationships and whatnot. You can think of it in analogous to sort of like how pain is helpful to growing people. Think of men in the trenches in
yeah.
war. They experience the pain of war, but it grows them closer together and they create bonds they could never have had without those experiences. Like why God can use pain for that same type of reasoning. And I expand upon this in a video I just did on the argument from suffering. So I go
saw
into
it.
it in a lot of detail there.
Yeah, it was really good. Yeah, it was a good video. Now, would you say that applies to, say, natural evil, right? So I can see the pain and suffering in terms of soul building, right? Making stronger um, characters. But would you say that applies to natural evil as well? In other words, that God sees all this natural evil occurring, yet He's not ending. He's not bringing about an end. Does that apply in the same way?
Somewhat. I mean, God is allowing us to experience natural evil uh, for this a lot of the same reason. It does contribute to overall soul building. It does build character in certain ways, and it's not going to cause lasting pain that's going to damage people for eternity on this sort
Right.
of setting. So my view is basically is that the story of Christianity is God showed up and said, "Hey, I have a good path forward. Listen to me, and you won't have to die. You won't experience pain as much. I mean, there will still be, of course, the pain of growing and maturing, but I'm going to minimalize it." Humans rejected that in Eden, and God allowed us to experience what world without His lordship is like, and that is filled with a lot of natural evil, a lot of things we don't understand, a lot of things we have to face on our own. Now, that may sound cruel, but if you understand the full picture of the Christian worldview, you will see that has very little overall uh, negative effects with while having lasting positive effects.
Right.
So, if you dream that you experience a natural disaster, you can learn a lot about yourself, what you would do in that type of settings. It's very good for understanding yourself. But when you wake up, it doesn't create lasting pain. Likewise, upon death, according to my worldview, is that we will wake up almost like from a dreamlike experience. All the pain will be put in that sort of dreamlike perspective, yet we will still have the soul building aspects, the character developments we got from those type of settings. So it won't create any lasting pain, but with creating lasting worth.
Right. So there's a greater good that outweighs all of this finite reality, right? So
Correct.
it's really predicated on an afterlife as well, of course. Because
Yeah. And now,
if there was no afterlife, then you know, God would be. I mean, this would be horrible. This would be horrific if there was no afterlife. I mean, this would just be, a really sick kind of game.
yeah, the God would be George R. R. Martin
Yeah.
or something. Yeah. This is a very brief summary. There's a lot more I could say on this, but check out
Yeah.
the video if anyone is more interested in that.
Cool. Okay, so question 10, why must God be perfectly good? Could God be evil?
So yeah, someone just did a 4-minute video response to me on if God could be evil and trying to present the evil God challenge. And he said that I had misunderstood it or something. And I was like, no, I just think that the way it's phrased originally is really bad, because the way it goes is look at all the evil and the good in the world. Okay, some people would argue the existence of good would debunk a perfectly evil God. And since I don't argue that way, his objection just didn't really affect me.
Mhm.
And the way I argue is that a maximally evil being would be just logically impossible. The reason being is because whatever God is, he could not he's got to be maximal one way or another according to perfect being theism. But there's no such thing as maximal evil, because no matter what you do, if you're doing something evil, you're doing it for something that you could argue is intrinsically good. So you could take a horrible rapist. He is doing it for pleasure. Now, by itself, pleasure is intrinsically good, even though he's going about it in very evil and horrendous ways. But he's still doing it to try to obtain something good for himself. By that logic, a maximally evil being is just impossible. You can't have such a maximally evil being. You could only have quasi maximally evil beings. There's no such thing as a maximally evil being. Now, the reason why God must be perfectly good would relate to perfect being theism, which we could talk more about. But basically, it's the idea that the foundation of reality, whatever it is, needs to be able to have an explanation in its own nature, in its own necessity. It cannot appeal to something else for its explanation. So perfect being theism would explain that, because the properties of the perfect foundation, namely God, would be entailed by its own internal nature of entailing perfection. So that would entail omniscience, omnipotence, moral perfection, necessity. Now, scholars or philosophers like Richard Swinburne or Brian Leftow will note that itself provides more explanatory scope than just saying God exists, than saying that God has these properties as a brute fact, because these properties are explained by God's own internal nature. God entails these type of qualities because he is a perfect being, and a perfect being's internal definition or internal nature entails absolute perfection. So you actually can have a being that is explained by its own necessity, and therefore you can have the PSR on a theistic account.
Okay. So it's kind of like a perversion of good, you would say.
Yeah, I would say evil is a perversion of good. There's no such thing as just evil by itself.
Yeah, I mean, that does make sense. Anything we do is for pleasure, in whatever it is. You know, it could be like you brought up the rapist. I mean, anything. Like, think about Ted Bundy, or he's doing that for some kind of pleasure and good. He thinks it's good. He enjoys doing it. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and same. I think C.S. Lewis said everybody does something for either power, pleasure, or safety.
Right. Okay, so question 11: if God really existed, he would not be this hidden. His existence would be obvious to everyone. His divine hiddenness. What did you say?
Yeah, the obvious response to that: if the Earth was round, it would be obvious to everybody. I mean, obviously, so that there must debunk the round Earth hypothesis. No, this is this idea that humans are some sort of like reason machines, and if God just gave them enough data, they'd be convinced.
Right.
I mean, Matt Dillahunty has said in debates that if like someone was resurrected in front of him, or if like the stars spelled out, Yahweh exists, he still wouldn't necessarily believe, because he could just say that's a trick from an advanced civilization. You can always reason. I mean, naturalism can always account for everything. You could just say if God appears in front of you having some sort of delusion, you can always account for these types of things. So no, the idea that the divine hiddenness would somehow, or that if God just appeared to everyone, it would fix all the problems, is just false, because people probably would still not believe. And if they did, that doesn't mean they'd actually love God. That doesn't mean actually, worship him or give the actual meaningfulness to that type of relationship. It's like if you and I just found out tomorrow that Zeus existed. I mean, I'd be like, okay, I mean, so what? That doesn't really change. Maybe we want to love him or worship him. There's more going on there. So God is working with subjective creatures that are self-centered, creatures that often want to believe what they want, to sort of try to grow mature, robust, cognitive theists. That takes time to grow, and you just can't do it by going, poof, here I am, now believe in me.
Right.
That's not going to get the right mentality you want. It could create a selfish mentality. Maybe I can use this being for my own prideful desires. All sorts of problems with that.
I think there's also a lot of value in doubt, wonder, and uncertainty as well. I was looking at, I have a couple notes here. This is from Josh Rasmussen. He says this in How Reason Leads to God. In one chapter, he talks about that, how there's a lot of value in doubting and wondering, right? Instead of it just being in your face, it could, that could create better.
It causes one to grow. It causes us to mature.
Yeah, right. Like the soul building.
Think for ourselves.
Right,
yeah,
exactly.
And that's what God wants. God doesn't want to just spoon feed us everything and give us all the basic things so that we just do what we're told. He wants mature individuals that actually follow him.
Right. Okay, so question 12. If there is a designer of the universe, God, this designer would be more complex. thus requiring a cause of its own. So, I mean, this is pretty similar to what caused God. I don't know if you want to touch upon this at all, or we could just go to the next question.
Well, I mean, we could talk about the complexity. Like, is God complex? Because I'll hear physicists in interviews saying the same thing. The first thing to note is not necessarily, because you can explain God's ontology in a sentence. Well, we can't explain the universe necessarily in a sentence according to its own ontology, because we'd have to include physics in a lot of ways. God's ontology is perfect being theism. So it would be a necessary being, an immaterial necessary mind that would entail absolute perfection. That is a very simple explanation. In a simple explanation, a simple being can have a complex thought, can do complex things. It doesn't require that ontology is therefore complex. So that's the first thing to say. And the second thing to say is, just because even if God was more complex, that would not mean he doesn't exist. If the evidence would still imply a complex foundation, we should actually follow the data there. I mean, Occam's razor is not just about the simplest explanation. It's about the simplest explanation that can adequately account for all the data. Mm-hmm. Do not multiply entities beyond necessity.
Right.
So if it was necessary, we should posit that. But I don't even think God is complex in that setting.
Yeah. So would you hold to divine simplicity?
To a degree. I think there might be
God's non-composite.
I don't know. Yeah, I would say that. I would have to formulate more about what I mean by that, though. I think I might have more of a modern version in my thinking, but
okay,
that's another subject.
Right. Okay, so question 13. Oh, I'm sorry. Something laptop just. Okay, so question 13. Why can't the fundamental laws of nature just be a brute fact? Why must we posit an explanation? So of course this would be a denial of the PSR.
Yeah, I think you could do that. It just doesn't have as much explanatory scope.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, there are atheist philosophers that just say that maybe nature is just a brute fact, or whatever caused the universe, that initial singularity. And I love it when they say singularity, because that's a bad word to use now, because the singularity in physics isn't a thing, it's a boundary point. But maybe there's this underlying quantum fluctuation, there's some sort of substance, whatever you want to call it, that just exists as a brute fact. Sure, you can posit that, but notice now your explanation has far less explanatory scope, because you just start saying things are brute facts without explanation. Sure, you can posit that, but if simplicity, according to Graham Oppie, is what wins the day, the naturalistic explanation is now out the window, because now you've posited something that doesn't have an explanation. It just is a brute fact.
Right. And I heard Ed Fazer say somewhere, he says it's like being a little bit pregnant. Either you are pregnant or you're not pregnant. So in other words, there's reasons for why everything exists here in the natural world, reasons, or explanations. But when we get to the very bottom, right, these very bottom fundamental laws, there's just no explanation at all. So it seems like there's either brute facts all the way down, or there are no brute facts, and there's explanations for everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you want to minimize brute facts. I believe Eric Lefto says like God is like the only brute fact, but even God has an internal nature to explain why he is the way he is, why he has his attributes. You don't have that on a naturalist explanation. You just have this underlying substance that somehow is different from all other natural substances because it's necessary and it's uncaused. And so then it just sort of causes things to happen on its own. It just gets really ad hoc. And so you posit all these brute facts.
And if it is a brute fact, it's also important to note that there is no philosophical, atheistic, theological, or scientific explanation. There's just no explanation, right? And that seems ad hoc too.
It's not the least ad hoc, for sure.
Right,
yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and then you could also add plausibility to that, because plausibility is the criterion that you want to add an explanation that explains more things with one explanation. So on a naturalistic worldview, you got to account for morality somehow. You got to account for consciousness somehow. You got to account for what gave rise to the universe somehow. Yeah. You got to account for all these other things. Where the theism, we have the moral argument, you have the argument of consciousness, you have the cosmological arguments, you have fine tuning. Theism can explain all of that with just one explanation, whereas naturalism is going to posit all these different explanations. You're multiplying entities beyond necessity, and you're losing plausibility, creating a more ad hoc explanation.
Right. And some atheists will say, well, give me an explanation. That's not an explanation. And it is an explanation. You might not like it, but posit a better explanation or try to refute the explanation that we're giving. Right.
No, they don't like it because they think it's just you're escaping everything. You're just saying God did it with everything. And it's like, well, no,
Yeah.
we're positing a coherent account, an ontological being that's defined properly, and saying that the data actually is best explained by this. You're doing the same thing with naturalism. What's the difference?
Exactly. Yeah. So this leads into my next question. Excuse me. So the cosmological argument posits a God of the gaps, right? In order to explain something which, in fact, is or either will be eventually better explained by naturalistic scientific theory. What are your thoughts on that?
No, that's a cheap and a bad argument. I hate the fact that atheists still try to use that at times.
Yeah.
Because you could just call anything a gap. I mean, young Earth creationists almost do this with evolution sometimes. Like you're just anytime you get some sort of fossil, you just explain it with evolution. You're arguing from an evolution of the gaps. Like that's silly. That no, they're saying the data is best explained by evolution. Likewise, we're saying this data is best explained by a theistic worldview. I could just do the same thing with them. I'm saying you're just finding something you can't explain, and you're explaining with naturalism, a naturalism of the gaps. Or you're positing a future humans of the gap. Anything you can't explain, you just say, well, future humans will explain it.
Yeah.
That in itself is more of a gap argument than theism. So it's kind of ironic.
Yeah, that's a big gap. I mean, you're saying that all of this data that we have right now it just doesn't mean anything. Like they'll find out one day in the future. I mean, if that's not a gap, then I don't know what is.
Yeah, that in itself is a gap,
right.
Not arguing for a theistic worldview.
Right. Okay. So question 15, why would the first cause be omniscient, omnipotent, perfectly good, and so on? Moreover, why call the first cause God?
Okay. Yeah, so it not necessarily has to be that. We would argue abductively that this would be a far more parsimonious explanation. So it's just simpler because you have a perfect being theism. Richard Swinburne says at one point, it's easier to posit a maximally great being than a quasi-maximally great being. Why? Because if it's quasi-maximally great, you have to explain why it has certain properties and why it doesn't. Some of them just are accepted as brute facts. It doesn't have these other properties by a brute fact. But a maximally great being, one that has absolute perfection, just sort of entails absolute perfection, and it's by its own nature. So it would be omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good, and necessary. It just entails these properties. And so it has an internal structure within its own nature that explains why it is the way it is. And so that's a simpler explanation. Now, that doesn't prove the first cause would be this perfect being, but we would argue abductively that this is a simpler explanation.
Right. Yeah. And I think I saw Swinburne say that somewhere. Why posit a trillion, just an infinite regress, just, forever and forever when we could just posit God, right? It's just seems to be a better explanation. And that's kind of what I said earlier. A lot of people will talk about proofs, give me a proof. It doesn't work that way. We have the data, we have the arguments, and what's the better explanation? And that's kind of how we infer.
I mean, that's really how we argue for just about everything, even in science. When you have competing interpretations of things, they're going to argue for simplicity. That's just the way we are. And I think that's I think we do that because that conforms to the way reality most likely is. It's always going to be the simple explanation. Unless there is, of course, more data to suggest a different explanation. Therefore, you posit a simpler explanation to account for that additional data. So you could say like, well, the simplest explanation maybe the view of Thales, that everything is just water. Sure, but that doesn't really account for all the data. So we need a more complex explanation than Thales' account because we have more data to explain. And when we get all of our data, we want the simplest explanation to account for that data.
Right. And I don't know if you touched upon this, but the second part of that question, why would we call the first cause God?
Yeah, it's the title. I mean, to me, it's
I saw your debate with Matt Dillahunty. And you said, I don't care. I don't care if you like it. It's just, you can call it whatever. Because he had a problem with that. You know what I mean? He was having a problem with, why you call it God. But it's kind of like Aquinas says, this is what we call God.
Yeah, it's funny that in that debate, that was his only objection to my argument. Right. It's just, I don't like that term because it brings baggage. Well, you've said a lot more than you realize by admitting that.
Yeah, right. Okay, question 16. This is an interesting one. Is it possible that God lacks one of the divine attributes, all powerful, all good, all knowing? So if this were the
I mean,
case, we wouldn't really need theodicies, right? Because if God is not all good, then okay, maybe that's why he allows evil. If he's not all knowing, he doesn't know that this is occurring, right? And if he's not all powerful, he can't stop it.
mhm. Yeah, we could. I mean, it's for all we know, it's possible. But according to perfect being theism, he wouldn't, and that's a simpler explanation. So it would just sort of piggyback on a lot of the stuff I was just sort of saying.
Right. Now, do you have any recommendations for perfect theism? Any books?
Yeah, check out a good place to start is Richard Swinburne's book, The Existence of God. That's a good place to start. And then there are some good papers, like I referenced in my recent debate. One is by Eric Lefto,
Okay.
and he's defending. I gotta find it here though, if you
Yeah,
want
yeah,
it,
go
because
for it.
I know it's around here somewhere. Because like these are pretty good ways to actually argue for that.
Okay.
So I will find them here in a minute. I probably
Yeah.
Eric Lefto, A Naturalist Cosmological Argument. It's a rebut to a naturalist cosmological argument, but it's just titled A Natural Cosmological Argument. So that's a pretty good paper. I did enjoy reading that one. And so if I can find the other one by T. Byerly, I would recommend that one as well. But I cannot seem to find that one.
Yeah, take your time. If you can't find it, no worries.
Yeah, I'm sure it's around here somewhere. Oh, another good one is From a Necessary Being to God by Josh Rasmussen. He presents a lot of the same stuff. And the paper by T. Ryan Byerly is From a Necessary Being to a Perfect Being. So there's some pretty good papers I'd recommend.
Okay, cool. Thanks. All right, let's see here. Okay, question 17. This kind of touches upon some stuff that we already said, but is it fallacious to assume that everything has a cause or an explanation? Is it at all possible that brute facts may just exist?
Well, I wouldn't say everything has a cause, but I would say everything has an explanation, either in its external or in its own necessity kind of thing. So I think we got to separate cause and explanation, because even someone like William Lane Craig doesn't argue everything has a cause. So I mean, of course, it's possible some things are just brute facts and the naturalist is actually correct. But I would argue we should reduce the number of brute facts, and theism is the best way to do that. Again, if simplicity wins today, theism is ultimately going to win, especially I would argue a theistic idealism, because on that view, we're positing less substances and we're positing, we don't have to worry about things like the hard problem.
Right. Okay. All right, let's see here. So question 18, is it possible that the universe itself, the Big Bang, laws of physics, etc., is the necessary being?
Yeah, it's entirely possible. So that's a lot of like an Oppian approach, is like you would sort of posit that it's just, this whole creation, or the natural world itself is the necessary being in his view. Again, then that includes a lot of brute facts, why things are the way they are, why you don't have an internal nature within that entity that could sort of explain its own necessity, explain its own attributes. You have that on theism by entailing absolute perfection as part of its own definition. So you get around that quite easily.
Right. Okay. Because I think I saw Graham Oppie say somewhere that, if contingent facts exist, does he? I haven't read a whole lot of Graham Oppie. Does he think that the universe is contingent?
Yeah, I think I remember that. I think what he sort of says is whatever caused the universe, that would be itself necessary, because he wants to avoid necessitarianism, the idea that everything the way it is necessary. There is no other possibilities.
But even the arguments. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, that was all I had to say.
Even the arguments of Aristotle and Aquinas, they don't even depend on there being a beginning. You know what I mean?
Right.
It's fine if the universe is eternal. That doesn't really, it's not a huge challenge to the arguments. Aquinas is just more interested in a sustaining cause. Even right now, it's not about just in the beginning of time, that first domino that was pushed over, just how right now everything is being sustained. What would that,
Yeah, and that's why some of my arguments I formulated more on the ideas of emergence or contingency, not so much cause, because cause a lot of people think implies time. I don't think that's necessary, but depending on your philosophy of causation, you may hold to this idea that it requires time.
Right. Okay, so let me see. Okay, so question 19. Perhaps there is a God, but this God is wholly deistic and has no interest in creation at all. What do you think about deism?
Yeah, I think it's possible, but my argument against that would be more it's the moral perfection aspect. So if the underlying foundation would entail moral perfection because of its own nature, a moral perfection would entail a little bit more interest in my view. So for example, if we found a planet with life on it, I think we would be far more interested in that planet, where it was going, what was going on there, than a planet that's just dead, that has no life. And I think that's because we as moral agents are interested in the affairs of other moral agents and what they are doing. Likewise, if the perfect being is morally perfect, I feel like he would also be interested in the moral affairs of the agents he has created.
Right.
Especially if you hold to the moral argument, I feel like that's a good argument against the deistic worldview, that there would be some sort of theistic involvement in this world. That if God sets certain values and duties for us, uh, that entails that he is sort of more interested in the affairs of agents versus not just being some sort of deistic God.
Yeah, deism just seems odd to me as well, that God wills to create and he didn't have to, right? Even Aristotle believes that God eternally contemplated, or rather contemplates himself, that there is no interest in creation, but it's kind of like the deadbeat dad, right? That God creates and he's just gone. And I think that has a lot of further problems in kind of going back to what I was just saying previously, that we have to look at what is sustaining all of contingent reality at this very moment. So deism just seems to have a lot of problems just on the face.
Yeah, it's a lot like the naturalistic version of the fundamental substance, in that some things are just sort of accepted as a brute fact, and we want to reduce the number of brute facts.
Right. Okay, so question 20, if there is a God, say the God of the philosophers, classical theism, this in no way shows the God of the Bible is true. What are your thoughts on that? I know these are two, separate things going on here, because I think you said before that you're a classical apologist, a classical theist, and then you
Yeah,
kind
I
of
think it
go
might
from
be more
there.
of like a quasi
Okay.
proof being that. I don't know where I really stand on that issue, but I'm a
Mhm.
classical apologist at least. But I mean, I would say the God of the Bible is consistent with the God of the philosophers. There's no difference. You just, I mean, you would not posit maybe like a Stoic type God. I mean, for the Stoics, God was like, they were more pantheists, and they thought, we were all aspects of God, and he is just continually recreating and destroying, recreating, destroying himself. So I think actually on the Stoics view, that in like a trillion years, you and I will be in this exact same spot, doing this exact same thing, saying the exact same things. Because on the Stoic God, it's like he just creates the universe, destroys it, and then does the exact same thing, and this just goes on infinitely. So there's an example. I would say that maybe certain aspects of philosophers of the past that God of Christianity is not compatible with. But with the general idea, I think that the God of the Bible is compatible with the omniscient, omnipotent, morally perfect, necessary being. And I don't think that'd be much of a problem.
Okay. Okay, so question 21, explain the ontological argument. And do you think this is a convincing argument? I've heard Alvin Planiga. I like Alvin Planiga a lot. I don't know if you've read his work. Have you read his work?
Oh yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
I think everyone has. um, but he says that this isn't really the most convincing argument. So I'm curious what you think about it.
Well, I think for humans, it feels sort of like, like a gotcha, like almost like it just can't be that easy.
Right.
Like you're going
Yeah.
to tell
Yeah.
me that you could just prove God from logic itself. Come on. So I feel like it is a sound argument. I think it's valid and it's sound. I just think for a lot of people, they just think just can't be that easy. So it's rejected. But I think the basic way is that the idea is that God would entail necessity in part of his nature. Excuse me. If God entails necessity, he can't be contingent.
Mm.
So if it's possible God exists, uh, then God would exist by that. Now, what do I mean? Well, you and I are contingent. It's possible we could not exist. But if something is necessary, it's either going to be possible or impossible. So I could say, there's a necessary dog out there. And I would say, well, such a concept is impossible because to be physical entails contingency. So it's an impossible concept. So because God entails necessity, it's either that he is possible or impossible. So it would be like this. I think Peter S. Williams formalizes the ontological argument like this. Like, if it's possible God exists, then God exists. Premise 2, it is possible God exists. Conclusion, therefore God exists. Again, it's about God's own necessity. Now, a lot of people go, well, what do you mean by possibility? It has to mean metaphysical possibility. It cannot mean epistemic possibility. It cannot mean mere logical possibility. But I think from cosmological arguments or teleological arguments, even the atheist acknowledges it's at least metaphysically possible for God to exist just from those other arguments. The ontological argument sort of swoops that up and goes, but because you've admitted metaphysical possibility from those, well, then because you've admitted that, God's own necessity would entail that God exists. So that's kind of how the ontological argument works in a rough understanding of it. And I think people don't find it convincing because they just sort of think it like as a trick. I mean, I'm just saying God is possible. I'm not saying God exists. They don't want to admit that sort of connection there. But I think proponents of it would point out, well, I mean, maybe, if God does actually exist, it would seem likely he would just show how simple it flows from logic kind of thing that gets to his existence. So you could maybe try to make that argument, I guess. But, I think a lot of people just aren't going to be convinced by that.
Right. Now, real quick, did you said it's not epistemically? You made a distinction there between epistemology and metaphysics. Could you just kind of touch on that?
So I would say, best to explain with an example. Like, for all we know, a square circle could exist, but metaphysically, we would say a square circle cannot exist.
Right. Okay. That's a good distinction. Yeah.
I would say the concept of God is pretty logically coherent. So logically, he could exist, and I would say, from arguments like the cosmological argument or teleological arguments alone, it's at least metaphysically possible God could exist. So ontological argument can swoop up that possibility and use it.
Right. Okay, question 22. This is pretty much the last question. We're wrapping it up here. What argument do you think is the strongest argument for God's existence? And what argument do you think is the strongest argument against God's existence?
I mean, I feel like it really depends on the individual. If I'm talking to more of a philosophical person, I might try to argue from a basic contingency argument to perfect being theism, because they understand the idea of parsimony, they understand explanatory scope power. If I'm talking to someone who's more into scientism, someone who is, you got to prove to me God exists from science kind of attitude, as fallacious as that is, I use something called the digital physics argument, because it relies on a lot of recent scientific findings to argue that there is probably a mind behind the universe. So I think it depends on who I'm talking with. If I'm talking to a non-natural moral realist that's an atheist, I might use a moral argument because they're at least giving me one of the premises of that argument.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And what would you say is the strongest argument against God's existence?
I would still say it's probably the problem of suffering, problem of animal suffering, maybe. I mean, that's always, but I mean, a lot of that just sort of still is like an emotional sting. Right. In a lot of ways. So that's why I think it's very convincing for a lot of people.
Oh, yeah, it certainly succeeds emotionally. I mean, I don't think anyone would deny that, but logically, I don't think it does. Have you read God? Plantinga wrote it, God, Problem, and Evil.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that was his defense of the free will defense. Yeah.
Yeah, that was really good. I also like just, touching on the problem of evil a little bit further. Justin Mooney, that example of the rainforest.
Oh yeah,
that's a really, I mean, that kind of just that hits you. That's really good.
If anyone wants to know, Justin Mooney gave me this analogy I use in my video on suffering. It's this idea, like, think of the rainforest. It's filled with suffering, but it's also filled with immense beauty. Now, if suffering was so bad that it outweighed the intrinsic goodness of life, we should destroy the rainforest. We should destroy all life because it will prevent countless generations of suffering going on. But we obviously recognize the rainforest is intrinsically good to the point that the suffering can never outweigh it. And so by that own logic, the intrinsic goodness of life is always going to outweigh suffering, and suffering is not enough to outdo how good the intrinsic goodness of life.
Right. Okay. Let's see. There's just one more question I wanted to ask you here. What do you think about like pop atheists like a Richard Dawkins, a Sam Harris, and also even maybe someone, I think Neil deGrasse Tyson is an atheist.
Yeah.
But I mean, what do you think about when they what do you think about these guys when they talk about?
Yeah, Neil deGrasse Tyson, I think, is an agnostic. Yeah, but yeah,
is
go
he?
on.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah.
Okay.
So what do I think about them?
Yeah.
I mean, I really don't want to become the Christian version of them. That's like a goal of mine. I don't want to be
Right.
like them in that kind of sense because, I don't think they go really in depth in a lot of things. I think they're just sort of like, they're there to give the average viewer, the guy who's just going to tune in, just something to think
Yeah,
about, but
right.
nothing really in depth, which is fine. I think maybe we're a little too hard on them for that. They understand their audience they're talking to in that sort of sense. They're not trying to go super in depth. But I mean, like, it's just still disappointing. They never try to encourage them to go any further beyond that. And that's what I would like to try to do. I think sometimes they say things that are just wildly inaccurate. They don't try to, they'll, I mean, I'm not perfect either, but sometimes they'll say things outside of their area of expertise, or they'll say things they just clearly haven't studied, and they'll just mess it up. Like I remember Neil deGrasse Tyson talking about truth, and he's like, there are different types of truth. There's real truth and there's your truth. And I'm like, no, there is truth. There is no difference there.
Yeah.
You just cannot have an internal truth that somehow contradicts external truth. And maybe you should explain more about the different philosophical views, because you could be like an anti-realist in terms of science and be an instrumentalist. Then you really can have this more of an internal sense of truth and just sort of explain things, and instrumentalists understand. But I mean, like, maybe give people a little bit more. But unfortunately, I don't think they do a good job of that.
Yeah.
Maybe we're being too hard on them. I don't know.
Right. And it really comes down to when you step outside of your field of expertise. I mean, that could be like stepping off of a cliff. I think I heard Thomas Sowell say this somewhere. And they're so popular. I mean, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, that when people, the laymen are hearing things from them, they're just immediately going to latch on.
Yeah, I don't fault them for stepping outside of their area of expertise, because we all do that. I remember one time I watched three people in a hangout criticize my digital physics argument, and their whole argument was, well, he's not an expert. None of them were experts, and I'm just like, this is so ironic. They don't even realize it. So I don't criticize them for stepping outside of their field. We all do that. Even Sean Carroll gave a hangout saying, like, I don't care if people talk about cosmology if they're not cosmologists, because I want to talk about other areas as well. I mean, we don't always have to be confined to this. So, but it's like the problem I feel like with them is when they do talk about these other things, they've never read experts. They've never studied up on it that much.
Well, that's what I meant.
That's
like more of my problem. Yeah. And I wanted to just read one more thing from David Bentley Hart. Have you read a lot of David Bentley Hart?
No, people have been encouraging me to, so maybe I should do that.
Really good, man. I mean, Atheist Delusions was great. I just want to read something. He says, Richard Dawkins is a perfect example. He does not hesitate, for instance, to claim that natural selection is the ultimate explanation for our existence. But this is a silly assertion and merely reveals that Dawkins does not understand the words he is using. The question of existence does not concern how it is that the present arrangement of the world came about from causes already internal to the world, but how it is that anything, including any cause, can exist at all. Even the simplest things and even the most basic principles must first be, right? And nothing within the universe of contingent things, nor even the universe itself, even if it were somehow eternal, can be intelligibly conceived of as the source or explanation of its own being. So that's from Atheist Delusions. And I'm only bringing that up because that's what I meant by stepping outside of your field. This assertion that Dawkins makes right here, that natural selection is the ultimate explanation for our existence. So people hearing that are going to, they're going to latch onto that. And he just doesn't know what he's even talking about. that's the problem. I mean, existence is just, not a lot of people think of the logical depths of existence. I mean, it's completely logically prior to any kind of cause at all. Right. So this is where philosophy comes in. And I think that's the big problem with a lot of these pop atheists, that, they're just wholly missing the mark there. So.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, but I mean, there's always going to be those popular.
Yeah, there's nothing to do about it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Now, here's the last question. This is the most important question. Where is your whiskey?
Well, it's only 2:00 over here. And
oh man, you don't start early? You got to start early sometimes.
I would be in bed if that was the case.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Mike, well, thanks, man. I think it was a great chat, and cheers, man. I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Cool, Mike. Thanks, man.